Right, time to get back into the swing of tutorials, right? It helps me learn, and hopefully it helps you learn something too. So, what are we going over today? Well, we're going to look at custom arrow effects, right? So right now we have a bow that is shooting explosive arrows. Now, I have achieved this through custom enchantments, right? So with the data pack now, you can create your own enchantments, but the system that I'm actually using to give the arrows their effects relies on functions. So I think we'll use command blocks first to go over the functions, and then we'll explain how to tie it into the new enchanting system, right? And then you can set up your own explosive arrows if you want. So what are we doing? Well, starting off, we have to basically set up a way to detect when the arrow hits something. Because if we use the in-game mechanism, so to speak, right, we have a husk, we have a bow, and we shoot said husk with the bow. A game event is occurring, and that's actually deleting the arrow, right? So as soon as the arrow comes into contact with the husk, the arrow disappears, the husk takes damage. Now, what this means is that this event is always going to run at the priority. So even if we have a system, for instance, to detect when an arrow hits something, such as this command, right? We'll turn it on and we'll go over it in a second. It's not actually going to work because the game event is still the priority. Therefore, the game event is deleting the arrow before the command block can actually register it. So if we then add another layer to it, which is to give the arrow in itself pierce, right? And then also a way to clean up the arrow ourselves, what we've now created is the game event, but instead of it being deleted by Minecraft, right, is now being deleted by the functions, meaning that we can then implement our own features or extra effects. In this case, all we're doing is saying hits, which also, there we go. We got the hit, right? Hitboxes are the next thing we need to sort of go over. So we shot one arrow, it modified it, gave it piercing. We shot a second one, same again, and then it said hit, and then it deleted the arrow just like the normal game event. Now the reason it didn't work the first time is if we open up the hitbox display, right? So F3B, we can see this is the husk's hitbox, right? This white outline, except it's not, right? If we shoot the husk in the head, the game knows it's the hitboxes are colliding, but when it comes to actually detecting the entity, that's not quite how it works, right? The hitbox of the husk is actually just its feet section. So again, if we shoot the head, nothing. But if they stops and we can shoot the little feetsies, right? Well, with a baby mob, it's a little bit harder, I guess. We'll do it with a full grown. Cool. Come on. There we go. We get the hit. So what we actually have to do is think a little bit more creatively, and rather than using a distance of 1, which should again occupy the hitbox, we need to think about the max size of a mob, which is 3, right? A husk is 2 blocks tall, a warden or iron golem is 3, so 3 is probably the number that you want to use, and now what this means is if we shoot the husk in the head, we still get that hit, right? Same with the little baby, if I can aim correctly. Yes, perfect, right? So now we have it set up so that we have created our own version, right, of the game event. So instead of, for instance, saying hit, what we could change it to is, I don't know, summon lightning bolt, right? That's nice and simple. So we'll summon lightning bolt at the location. So what we've now created are lightning arrows, right? Nice and simple. So with that in mind, we then can tie that in to the enchanting system and therefore also create a whole set of them to do different things. So we'll turn this back to just say hits, right? And we can turn it off for now because we have one more component to go over. So how do we differentiate then between different arrows? Well, we're going to use the tagging system. So for instance here, I have a very generic function, which is just execute as run tag, right? So basically any arrow that spawns in the world, it's going to tag it with enchanted, and then we have a effect, if you will. So when there is an arrow with the tag enchanted, it's going to then run a particle trail, right? So it looks like this if we turn it on. The arrow gets tagged, and it leaves a trail of the enchant particles. Now this is basically the system that we're going to use with the bow in terms of the enchanting system, right? So we'll turn that off for now, and I will just post all the commands. So starting off, we have our arrow system. So again, first step is to give it PS level 1. That way it can go through the entity and therefore not trigger the game event, right? And then we have our actual effect to cause the arrow to run any sort of effect or function or, summon or do whatever you want it to do. So we're doing execute as, right? Type is arrows. So that covers the normal arrows and the spectral arrows. We're detecting when it leaves the player's hitbox, right? So left owner 1B, and then we're making sure it's not in the ground, right? So once the arrow stops moving, it gets this flag in ground 1B, right? So we're making sure it doesn't have that. Then we're doing a check to see if it collides with an entity. So if entity distance ... 3, so a 3 block radius basically around the arrow. And then we're making sure to exclude the arrow in itself so it doesn't trigger off of, itself. And then from there, we're doing our run. And in this case, I'm doing say hits. Again, nice and simple. You can do lightning, you can do potion effects, you can do splash potions, you can do a whole bunch more arrows. Anything you really want. You can make teleport or place blocks or delete blocks, right? So yeah, nice and simple, and I will put these in the description. But now we have to tie these into the new way to set up enchantment. So we'll set day, right? And I will open up the data pack folder. So we have tutorials, right? Data, and then we have our data pack, so custom enchants. And then in here we have two. We have functions, right? Which again are going to be the commands we just went through. And then enchantment, which is the new way to set up your own custom enchant. So in here we have bow enchants, just a subfolder. And then we have made 5 already, right? So explosive, freeze, shrink, storm, and wind burst. Now, if we open up explosive, so I have gone over this previously, and I'm sure many people have covered the way to actually set up enchants, but you can just use an online generator. But what we want to use is tick and projectile spawn, right? So projectile spawn triggers when the arrow is first created, and then tick occurs as long as the enchanted item is in its correct slot. So in the case of a bow, main hand, offhand, case of armor, right? Any of the equipment slots. So we're doing 2 functions. Again, exactly the same as the command blocks that we set up. Think of this as function 1, and think of this as function 2, right? So we're triggering the hits, and we're also tagging it and giving it PS. So going back to the document, right? Again, they just go to the functions in the data pack. So we have arrow check and arrow spawn. Now I've also added a play sound effect, right? Just for flavorfulness. You can also add a particle, right? There's many other things that you can add. And then these are just the generic stuff that you fill in, right? How much the enchanted book costs to apply, what levels it shows up for in the enchanted table, and then of course what items you can actually enchant with it. So yeah, nice and simple. Again, probably best to use a generator if you don't know how to write them from scratch, although the wiki does help out immensely with that. But then we can, of course, go back over to the function side of the data pack, right? So arrow enchants, and then again, we can open up to spawn, and then the check. So spawn occurs when the arrow is first produced, in which case the enchantment is acting on behalf of the arrow as its target, meaning we can use @s. So again, we're giving it PS1 to make sure that it can travel through a mob, and then we're also tagging it so that we can identify it, right? And you make sure it has its own unique effect rather than just triggering off of any arrows, right? So tag it, enchanted explode, and give it PS1. Then on that tick event, right, in the enchantments, we're running this function. So execute as the arrow, right? Make sure the tag is the correct. Make sure it is not in the ground, so it's still traveling, and we're making it run a particle, right? So this will make the arrow leave that trail of smoke if we use the explosive arrow bow, right? Perfect. And then from there, we have 2 sets of functions, basically. We have if it hits an entity, and then we have if it lands in the ground. So again, they start almost identically, right? Execute as the arrow. Because remember, the enchantment itself is operating as the bow, or the player in this case, not the arrow, unlike that spawn event. So we're making sure it's not on the ground, but has left the player's hitbox so it doesn't explode straight away, right? And then we're detecting if it collides with an entity, that's not an arrow, and then summoning TNT with a short fuse so it explodes straight away, right? And then if that is accomplished, it's going to delete itself so it doesn't loop and trigger repeatedly. Then down here, we have what happens if it lands in the ground. So rather than it being a blacklist statement, right, with in ground and the exclamation mark, we now have it set to if it's in ground and has left the player's hitbox, it will then explode. So for instance, if we shoot it at our feet, right, it's not actually going to trigger because it's never left our hitbox. But if we shoot it and then walk away, it will explode, right? Because the arrow is explosive and it will still leave the player's hitbox when we move away, right? Now, again, I have made a few of them, so they're slightly different each and every one of them. So why don't we just go through them and then we can look at the subtle differences within the actual functions. So we have 5, I believe, yeah. So we have explosive, oh, I need the anvil, freezing, shrinking, storm, and wind burst. So I grab out an anvil, and then we'll grab out a bow, and then we're good to go, right? So plop it down, and we just go 1 bow, 1 book, and there we go, lucky last. So now we have our 5 different bows with our 5 different arrow effects. And of course, we could also double them up, right? I haven't made them incompatible with one another, but if we grab out some guinea pigs by way of husks, we can spawn them down, and we can try out the different bows. So we have Storm, nice and simple. Instead of summoning TNT, summons lightning, right? But this one does not trigger when it just lands on the ground. It only triggers if it hits an entity. Then after that, we have Shrinking, although you're done, so I need a new one, right? So Shrinking, nice and simple, will shrink whatever mob it hits, right? But only once. And the way we're doing this is using the attribute system. Then we have Freezing, which will summon a 2x1, right? set of pounded snow as well as giving the mob slowness, right? So my version of what freezing is when it comes to mind, right? And then explosive we've gone through, and then that leaves windburst, which, similar to explosive, will summon a windburst, whether it hits ground or if it hits a entity. That we don't have one, right? So windburst, done. Perfect. Cool. So how do they look in the actual function files? Well, if we open them all up, so explode, freeze, shrink, storm, and windburst, and again, all these spawn functions are identical. All we're doing is giving it Pierce level 1, right? And then tagging it with whatever tag we're going to use to identify the specific effect that we want to trigger. So then we have, again, explode, and then we have freeze. So in this case, the particle's different, and the event that occurs when it hits the entity is different, right? And we've also then deleted the event if it lands in the ground. Then we have shrink. So again, once it hits the entity, we're using the attribute function, right? So instead of it being an if statement, this is an as statement so that it targets the entity that it hits with. Then we have storm, which we're using an at to make sure the lightning summons at the entity's location rather than the arrow's location. And then lastly, we have wind burst, right? Which is again using the if statement, but then summoning a wind burst charge that will have a negative Y motion, so it goes down straight away to try and hit a block, and therefore explode on contact, right, near-ish to the mob that it hits from. So that is basically it, right? Nice and simple. Again, it's all about just overriding the game event and creating your own event for it to detect it hitting something. But in the case of this in the tagging system, while we have tied into the enchantments, you can set this to detect a player's inventory, right? So you could do execute if data, right, on the entity, make sure it's set to all players. So you will actually have to do execute as at all, and then if data at S, so this will weed out and only function for any entity, right? And then you could do inventory, or you could do selected item, right, if you want to look for a certain bow, and therefore it will only apply to the arrows created from that player. But I think we'll leave there, right? If I've left anything out or I've missed a step, do let me know. I'm trying to get back in the swing of things. I'm not the best at teaching or explaining, right, how my mind works, but hopefully it helps. If you have questions, feel free to ask. I'm always happy to figure stuff out and work through them. Yeah, leave there. Hope you enjoyed. See ya.